Welcome to the podcast series, Ascendem, brought to you by Heidelberg University's Graduate School for Humanities and Social Sciences. Tune in for thought-provoking interviews with experts in different fields, from the social sciences to the humanities, from law to economics. Hello and welcome to the HGGS podcast series, Ascendem. Today we have a really special guest, and we are really glad to have Dr. Martin Hofmann, research scholar and lecturer in the field of intellectual history at the Heidelberg Centre for Transcultural Studies, Heidelberg University. Welcome, Professor.
Thanks for having me.
Today we are going to talk about a really interesting topic. The topic is titled Strange Creatures, Imaging and Imagining Other Peoples. So, I'd like to first, Professor, start with asking your academic background, and maybe then we can move on to the fields that you have worked on.
I'm trained as a sinologist originally, and I did my PhD on Chinese history, and I did classical studies in China. And after my PhD, I went on to an institute for the history of science. So I kind of switched fields and did my postdoc there and did history of science for about 2.5 years. And then I came to Heidelberg and switched my field again because I did transcultural studies. And when I came to Heidelberg doing transcultural studies, I had no idea what transcultural studies actually means. So I had to kind of learn this. But I've done this now for more than 10 years. And I guess I now understand what transcultural studies is for and why we do it. And so I can teach seminars in this field.
Actually, that's a great point to ask you this question then. What should we understand under this term, actually, transcultural studies, maybe also the intellectual history? But first, we can also start with the transcultural studies, maybe.
Well, transcultural studies started here at Heidelberg with the Excellence Initiative, and it was a collaboration of many different institutes that looked for an umbrella term. Transcultural studies can be applied to different fields or the approaches in transcultural studies. The idea is basically to say cultures are not containers that are kind of separate from each other and can be clearly divided. But cultures interact, they're not stable, they always is kind of back and forth. There are links between different cultures, there's exchange of knowledge, of ideas, of goods, people travel. And what we do in transcultural studies mainly is to look at these interactions and these movements and look at why certain ideas are accepted in one place, how they are modified when they travel, how they change, why certain types of knowledge become relevant for people, why certain actors have influence in certain debates, and what the link between different ideas or concepts or goods is and what they mean to different people. And that is what distinguishes transcultural studies from, for example, from comparative studies, where you mainly look at one thing A and compare it to the thing B. We look at the kind of concrete interaction.
Thank you so much for this really wonderful and also informative definition, but maybe moving on to the definition of the intellectual history. So I would like to ask you to maybe elaborate on the differences of intellectual history from the other fields of history and maybe some examples of topics covered in this field in terms of your research area.
Yeah, I mean, we do mostly intellectual history of East Asia, but working at the Institute for Transcultural Studies, of course, will again look at the exchanges of knowledge, of ideas. Why is certain knowledge relevant in certain places for certain actors? How does the knowledge exchange function? Why do certain ideas matter? When do they matter? Why do people reject certain ideas? How does this fit with epistemic agendas? We are historians, but with a very special focus on certain ideas and the circulation of ideas. And so it's more related to interaction of very different actors. We do not only look at philosophers, even though philosophy matters for us, but it's more on different kinds of ideas and different exchange processes that we look at. And that may involve ordinary people.
Oh, that's also a really informative definition. So I'd like to more concretize one of the topics that you covered actually in this field. Maybe you can also name it as intellectual history or transcultural studies, strange creatures, imaging and imagining other peoples. So I'd like to ask you first, what was your motivation to choose actually this really interesting topic? And also I'd like to inform our audience that Dr. Hofmann also gave a presentation on this topic in our discussion forum, which also held many interest from the other PhD students. So I'd like to ask first, how did you actually come up with this topic?
That's actually a long story. When I wrote my PhD, it was because I was trained as a sinologist, I was working with texts. But in the texts I was working with, there were certain maps included because it was a discussion about the geography of antiquity in commentarial texts. And some of the authors used maps. And so I later gave presentations on my topic, and most people were not very interested in the commentaries and what the commentaries actually do, but rather in the images that I added to make my presentation a little more lively. And so I realized there's real interest in these images and how they function and what they say. And so actually only after finishing my PhD, I kind of focused more on the image part and then studied maps and then started to study other visuals that are related to spatial ideas and spatial notions. And here the strange creatures come in. And so I later developed classes that deal with these topics. So classes on cartography, but also classes on how people perceive others in the world and what ideas of space are related to the cartographic depictions, but also to the creatures that somewhere out there dwell.
Well, if I interpret it correctly, then maps are also playing a great role both in your academic career and also specifically in this topic, in this project. So then I'd like to elaborate more on this topic, maps, as a specific type of image or as a medium, actually. And first, I'd like to then ask this question, how do maps differ from other type of images in terms of reading and understanding them? Or how should we understand maps as a medium in intellectual history?
Well, first of all, maps, I think, should not only be studied by art historians. Maps present certain ideas about how the world is constructed in the eyes of the map maker, how certain spatial entities are related. And so they tell us about worldviews and about certain interests in parts of the world. And also they sometimes suggest how certain parts or administrative structures or power hierarchies are related. So that makes maps an interesting field for actually not just me as an intellectual historian. They can also be used in political studies, or they can be used as a kind of ethnographic sources. So maps should be studied by many different people from different angles. And I think this would enrich map studies greatly if more people would engage with maps. The original approach to maps was to look at how maps can convey certain arguments or content of text better than actually written linear text. And this is related to a general interest that we have here at the Chair for Intellectual History at Heidelberg. That is the question, how and why certain arguments are made and how they are regarded or why they are regarded as valid. And here my maps play a role because maps can sometimes convince people of certain ideas better than text can, because a map can show certain relations in a way that is very easy to understand for the reader. Of course, the reader needs to understand a certain cartographic language, so the reader has to be able to decode the message. But then maps often can show relations quite easily and easy to understand for the reader. And in this way, they are kind of more immediate and sometimes perhaps even more compelling than just written linear text. And so my interest is basically why and in which situations are maps used to supplement or to replace textual explanations.
And we have concentrated on the one side of the story, the maps itself, but there's also the culture there, people who also draw these maps and also people who are represented, their values are represented in these maps. So what would be the ethnographic description of a culture that is conveyed by the maps? So the maps are really good ways to understand the ethnographic descriptions of a culture in terms of your historical research?
Well, of course, maps make hierarchies. They structure the world. Of course, not all maps show other people, but when they show other areas of the world, they sometimes add information. And the interesting part is to see what type of information is added, how are people living elsewhere characterized, or if we don't learn about the people themselves, we learn something about the place. Is this kind of a normal looking place? Is it big? Is it small? Are there certain special features depicted in this place? Do we see animals? Do we see parts of nature? And all this tells us about the perception on what people know about the place, but also how they envision the place.
You also mentioned about that your research is more focused on the East Asia culture. So we are talking about maps, and normally we understand as a common sense that maps serve a particular purpose actually, and they maybe do not differ from each other significantly. But how do they differ in Eastern culture, in East Asia culture, and also in Europe maybe? How do the maps in Eastern culture differ from the European counterparts?
Maps, as most knowledge is, they are based on certain epistemic ideals, certain contexts. And of course, the East Asian context is a little different, and there are different epistemic ideals. So epistemic ideals have also shifted in Europe. Medieval maps look different from our present-day maps. And so our present-day assumption that a map should be mathematically accurate is just a kind of present-day assumption. Pre-modern maps did not always have this function, and actually even our modern maps are based on certain ideas, and they use certain conventions, and they are not kind of neutral and objective. So pre-modern East Asian maps, of course, also have their certain functions. They have certain contexts. They have their audiences. They try to convey knowledge in a way that the reader can understand it. They assume that the reader has some pre-knowledge. So there's always a kind of a larger context involved. And of course, we cannot study the maps without looking into these debates. So when I study maps, I have to read a lot of texts to understand the context of what is depicted there.
So there's an interrelationship between maps and texts, actually, to understand these maps better. Yeah.
Definitely, yes.
Yeah. And also I'd like to concentrate on these special features in these maps, the imaginary creatures. So I know that there are many of them, but maybe to inform our audience about their existence, what kind of imaginary creatures are we talking about right now when we say that, okay, these imaginary creatures on these maps exist?
Well, there are traditions in Europe as well as in Asia to have certain ideas about faraway places where strange creatures dwell. And sometimes we see references to these creatures on maps, often just the names of these creatures. Sometimes, and this is a European thing, we have this as part of the ethnographic information. And there's always a gray zone between what is ethnographic information and what is probably based on hearsay or certain older stories about certain places where you also make depictions of these faraway peoples. And that is something that is transgressing the boundaries of literature and of factual accounts where people try to base their knowledge on experience. But we see that there's kind of often a mix of those knowledge spheres, so we cannot draw a clear line between this is the fantastic part and this is the factual part, even though many of these materials are still described with these categories even today.
So maybe we should also put this imaginary part in quotation marks, because we cannot really differentiate between factual and imaginary in this part.
Well, now that we kind of know many creatures on this planet, we kind of realize that certain creatures don't exist. But it is in fact not easy to make these distinctions, and it's actually something that we still today play with in our present-day ideas. Think of science fiction. I mean, we now think about faraway worlds somewhere in our universe, but we still think that there might be some strange creatures out there, which is often, of course, literature. But as I said, in my sources, there's often some overlap between the genres. And so I have administrative handbooks, for example, where you still have these references to certain places and descriptions that we would now, from our present day point of view, label as fantastic. But it was important knowledge for the people at the time to make sense of the world.
Yeah, that's a really important point, actually. But maybe we can also find some clues for my next question in the answers that you've already given. But I'd like to ask to concretize more on the question of why do these imaginary creatures appear? And did the historical audience believe that these creatures actually existed?
Yes and no. There are references to kind of old Chinese books that Chinese later scholars in late imperial times, for example, would label as fantastic. And say, no, we cannot believe that. We should not trust this. This is not a good historical source. On the other hand, though, these ideas of these people living somewhere, as I've already mentioned, then also appear in books that have, for example, an administrative purpose. And so we sometimes see this overlap of different types of knowledge. And that is not just in East Asia. There's a very famous example that the Jesuit Matteo Ricci then, because he, from Chinese sources, learned about the land of the dogs, then included the land of the dogs on his world maps. These maps that are usually celebrated for kind of bringing the idea of continents and Western geographical knowledge to East Asia. And so again, here we see this overlap of different knowledge spheres, and the problem for the people at the time to distinguish between what is actual fact-based knowledge and what are just older accounts where people try to make sense of the areas that they have heard about but not seen, or some people have seen them but have kind of exaggerated certain things, or just in the transmission things have changed over time so that they sound a little strange for a present-day readership.
But are there any recognizable patterns among these different imaginary creatures, actually? Because when we are talking about these imaginary creatures, it's not the same creature, actually. There are many different creatures in different maps. So is it possible to recognize some patterns?
We see certain patterns. We see that certain creatures strangely appear in maps. For example, Japanese maps often have ethnographic depictions above and below the map or right and left of the map, and often have the land of the dwarves and the land of the giants involved. On Chinese maps, there is a certain period where the lands of people with long arms and long legs appear, and the lands of just the females, and then at some point they disappear. Why that is still not entirely clear, and it's something that I would kind of work on in the future a little more. So far we can just see that certain ideas are around. They are often overlapping traditions, and we can see certain developments, but most developments are not easy to explain, and it's just one of the many developments that we see. And why a certain knowledge is included in a particular map is often hard to explain if we don't have any sources that accompany the map. And then we can just infer certain things by the structure of the map or by the additional knowledge that we find on the map, why certain elements are included and others are excluded.
Actually, based on what you said, maybe the other factor that made this interpretation process of these maps more difficult is that we are talking about a really long time frame. Maybe could you concretize more? Which time frame are we talking about? And also, maybe as a follow-up question, I'd like to ask, is there a recognizable pattern of change actually through this time frame until the disappearance of these creatures?
This is not easy to answer because we have, as I said, various coexisting map-making traditions. And so we should not think of the development of cartography as a linear process from the kind of the crude and fantastic to the ever more scientific and accurate. this is not how maps develop. Certain authors have certain ideas, what they want to kind of show in their maps, and for them, accuracy may matter. But for other authors, because they want to highlight particular features, the accuracy doesn't play a role. And this also goes for the strange creatures. We see them sometimes. We can distinguish certain periods in time where they come up more. But as I said, why exactly this happens is something that still needs to be explored. And I maybe in a couple of years I can come up with a better answer. I still don't know exactly. So it's, of course, with the emergence of Western knowledge did not change everything immediately. So I've mentioned the Western map-making practices being introduced to East Asia through the Jesuits. This was not a game changer immediately. But of course, towards the end of the 19th century, we see a change. Map-making practices then start to change, and then Western ideas and Western ideals of map-making become more important, and then certain map-making traditions just disappear because then there's a clear definition of what a map should be and how it should function, and that is very much related to Western ideals of map-making.
So it's fair to say that there's a really great tension between this factual information that we can get from these maps, presenting the reality itself, but also the imaginary or fantastic information. And then I'd like to connect this point actually with the disappearance of these creatures in the later era. So is it possible to say that factual information has become more important in that era, so that maybe these creatures started to disappear from these maps? Or are there any other factors that played a role actually in the disappearance of these facts? And I have to say that as a personal opinion, I'm really sorry to lose these fantastic creatures from these maps. Today's maps would be much more better looking actually if we had these imaginary creatures on these maps.
I think the map makers today are very creative. So we have fantastic things on maps, and maps are still made for different purposes. What we, of course, see is that map making changed at a certain point and the creatures disappear because certain conventions change. And the purpose of the maps becomes more unified, and there's kind of then experts for map making. They are trained as map makers. Before that time, it was basically scholars often who made maps together, sometimes with experts on, well, local knowledge sometimes. But usually this was just within the sphere of the scholar who was not an expert. Only at the imperial court, maybe there were experts who kind of were making maps kind of more frequently. But usually, and the most maps that we have, either we don't know the author, or we know the author and then we know that this was just a scholar who made a map based on his knowledge and the knowledge he had gathered, sometimes together with colleagues, but he was not a map-making expert. And in the 20th century, of course, this changes. Then you have this as a kind of field, an academic field, and people are trained in a certain way. And then, of course, they follow these conventions. And this leads to a certain, well, unification of practices and also certain standards that you follow. And this, of course, takes something away. Yeah, bad enough. But as I said, today you can create so many fantastic things, especially online. You find many fantastic and creative maps. So the creativity, to some extent, is back.
I'd like to ask one more provocative question, actually. And are there still hidden, undiscovered, strange creatures waiting for us to be discovered, maybe, in terms of these maps? What is the current situation in terms of the discovery of these strange creatures right now, or creating a typology of these creatures right now?
I think it depends on what maps we can kind of find somewhere where you may find new creatures. I think the more interesting part is, why do we have these kind of creatures, or where do they come from? And we know that there's a certain kind of exchange of knowledge, and that certain, for example, stories from the Arabic world came to China, and there's a certain overlap, and certain ideas may have inspired the description of these strange creatures and also the depiction, or the idea where these strange creatures are actually located and where you then put them on the map. And so I think there is still a lot to do in terms of research to kind of find out why exactly we have certain stories and where the kind of stories originally come from, and what the kind of relation to other areas in the world is if it's all kind of coincidence or if we really have some ideas that traveled far and then were changed and modified to again fit into the new context where they then appear. And here I think there's still a lot of research to do.
It seems like in your area, you will be more focused on maybe in these questions, but later on I'm going to ask you about your future plans, of course. But maybe to conclude this imaginary, in quotation marks, this imaginary creatures part, I'd like to ask one more question, and that is how imaginary are these creatures actually, or do they express values or attitudes toward foreign societies in some certain contexts, or can we recognize these patterns in these creatures?
Well, of course, there are certain ways to show that certain faraway creatures are maybe primitive, even barbaric somehow. So you often depict them as with animal traits, or you show that they are simple. They don't have a decent language. They don't have a writing system. They are dressed in very simple dress. They eat strange things. So you have these things. We shouldn't forget that some of these accounts, of course, were used in coffee table books. They were meant to entertain as well. So there are certain stereotypes included here and certain ideas of what is culture and what is not. And of course, the people who collect these stories often see themselves as the cultured, and the people far away are the counterpart, which kind of fits to your podcast, us and them. Yeah, there is this relation here. We are different from the others, and the others are somehow strange. This is why I chose the title Strange Creatures. Having said this, we should, of course, not forget that some of the creatures are deities, so they do not always have a low status. And there's also a certain respect towards them, even to those people that are portrayed as simple and not having a high language, but sometimes they have certain strengths, physical strengths, or also kind of a certain type of morality that is actually admirable. And so it's not all negative, it's not all looking down, even though we have certain stereotypical ways of describing these people.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor. And right now I'd like to move on with the more methodological questions, because you already mentioned about these maps as images and also icons. And maybe on that point, we also have to talk about the iconic turn as a pragmatic shift in understanding symbols. So images have become more important in cultural history, maybe in the modern times, of course, or postmodern time, I would also say. And they have developed their own methodologies. So how would you elaborate on this pragmatic shift within the framework of your research and understanding of the images? So would you like to say maybe, or is it fair to say that images have become more important actually when compared with the texts?
Well, I wouldn't say they are more important, but I don't like the word turn. There are too many turns in academia. But I would support the iconic turn. I understand the claim and I support the claim that images should be taken seriously, not just by art historians, but in all of humanities. I have learned sinology, so my basic training was language training. And so I've read a lot of texts and I tried to become proficient in Chinese and learn the language. So text was my primary medium. And I can still see this in my field, but I can also see this in many other fields. Images should be taken serious as a medium of expressing ideas, and we should not, just because they have maybe colors or they have some artistic features, just say this is just artistic, or we should not treat them as just always padding to the text. They have functions and they are used for purposes, and they are depicting things in a certain way that readers can understand and follow, or in ways in which they can educate their readers. And so I think images should be a normal subject of study, just like text, in many fields, in the humanities, in the social sciences, well, even charts or certain things, you need to understand, and you need to know how to read them, and you need to understand the conventions behind them in order to not misread what you think you understand. And therefore, I would say, yeah, iconic turn is important. Images are still sometimes used carelessly, and some scholars just look at images and presume they understand without kind of then looking for evidence and looking at the kind of relation to text and larger discourses. So I think a lot of research still needs to be done in this regard, and I'm absolutely happy to contribute to that.
That's really great news, actually. We will be also really happy to follow your next research and also talk about them maybe in the future in this podcast. But you used a specific framing, actually, not to misread these images. So presupposing that there's a correct way of understanding these images. So it's a more philosophical question maybe. But I'd like to ask you, what should be our mindset actually in order to interpret these images originating from another culture? What should be our actual toolbox maybe? I'm asking this question because you are also settled in Heidelberg in Germany, and you are also concentrating your work on East Asia. But apart from the language, maybe what would be the other factors which a researcher should take into account?
Well, the danger, of course, always is that we misread images because we assume that something that we see, a certain symbol, means the same thing in a different culture. Or we make the assumption that people who make certain images have the same epistemic ideals, or that images in a certain context want to say the same things that we would expect them to say in our kind of present-day context or in the kind of history that we know and are kind of familiar with. So there are certain kind of dangers here to kind of misread and misunderstand. Of course, pictures can be misread. They need to be interpreted, just like text. Text is also, in certain ways, vague. Words and whole sentences can be misread, or the emphasis in reading certain texts can shift. And just think of all the kind of different interpretations of sacred texts like the Bible. You have so many different interpretations of the same text. Here you see that you can do many things also with written text, and you can draw different conclusions from text. And the same can be done with images, of course. You can read an image at a certain point and it may speak to you in a certain way, and it can mean different things for a later reader, and he may look at the image in a different way. So for us, it's important to be careful with the context, to be careful with the epistemic ideals, with the conventions that we know of, and to try to find out what might this image do. And for me personally, when I do this research, I'm always thankful when the images are in books and I can read text, because that, of course, then helps me to better understand what the author may have intended when making a certain picture and why the picture is at a certain page in my book and what it contributes to the writing. So I'm not calling for kind of just image studies with images. There is, of course, we have to make use of all sources that are available to us in order to better contextualize what we have and then try to understand what they are. But it's, of course, it is an interpretation.
As a follow-up question, actually, in this framework of reading these images correctly, there is this danger of understanding the images of the past with the today's mindset and also misinterpreting them because of this background information. So what should be our epistemic mindset in order to grasp actually these historical facts, or what do they historically represent actually?
Yeah, well, just not approach these historical materials as if they were present-day materials. Very simple.
That's a really brief and fair answer. Thank you so much. And also one last question in this methodology part, I'd like to also state this fact that even when focusing on a specific region, one still encounters diversity in cultures and worldviews. So the same image may also be interpreted differently within a single culture. You also briefly mentioned about it, but maybe I'd like to ask you to concretize, does this create challenges for understanding and interpreting the images you work with, these different interpretations in the same culture itself? Or which methodology should we use in order to understand this correct interpretation within the same culture of the same image?
Well, first of all, we should not look for easy linear developments in how images are used. Images can be used in various ways, and some practices to kind of make use of images appear at a certain point, they disappear, and then centuries later, they come back. So we have certain gaps, we have certain traditions of making images that coexist for a certain period of time. We have certain practices that are kind of used frequently, but suddenly there's a shift, certain things disappear, just as we've talked about before, the strange creatures. Some of them are integrated into maps and then suddenly they are gone. And it's not so easy to understand why exactly this happened. There's not the one and only methodological approach that I can suggest here. There is simply the need to contextualize as much as possible to see what's going on. And as I said before, some of the scholarship that I see is trying to read images a little too quickly, and in this way overlooks the concrete circumstances and the agendas, and also the kind of the possibilities or the possible alternatives. What could have been shown, what has been shown before, and what is the kind of the larger context of the discussion? What are the intellectual questions? What are certain agendas in politics, but also among scholars? What is the philosophical background? What is the kind of the social and economic background? Why do we see certain things come up? How is this related to kind of print technologies, artistic forms of expression, and so on and so on? And so it's often not simple to kind of look at all this, and maybe not a single scholar can be an expert in all of these fields, but we have to try hard and kind of collect knowledge in order to come up with better answers. And this is, of course, beauty of research, that we are collaborating and we have many colleagues around the globe, and everyone contributes something. And in the end, we come to a better understanding of these images.
It's also really fair to say that the interdisciplinary research then plays a really key role, actually, in order to understand these images.
Absolutely. And this is why I said the iconic turn should matter for different fields, because we need experts who are trained in different ways and have different ways of looking at these images in order to just better understand what we are working with.
Well, Dr. Hofmann, thank you so much for this wonderful interview. I feel myself really informed about this topic. And before moving on to the personal reflections, I just want to mention really briefly about my personal experience. After your presentation in our discussion group, I started to look at the maps when I confronted them in the museums in a different way. And I don't really remember which museum was that. And the first time that I saw a strange creature on a map, I was really, really thrilled. And because that was something that I can see right now, because I was looking at these maps through different glasses. So thank you so much for choosing this interesting topic and also sharing your insight with us.
That's very encouraging for me, that someone is kind of walking through the world and looking at things differently. That is the best that can happen.
Thank you so much. So as a last question in our informal part, I'd like to ask you about what are your future academic plans or research projects that could be either personally or within the broader field of intellectual history or maybe as a department?
I'm not going to talk about the department and things like that.
Sure, as you wish.
This is a little too broad. See, the presentation that I've given here in the discussion group has actually inspired me to go into this direction a little more, because a couple of months later, in July, I've given yet another presentation on the topic in the framework of a cartography conference. And due to the feedback that I received, I really felt, okay, I think I should write something on this. On the aspect that I said is still unclear to me and slightly problematic. Why do certain names of creatures suddenly appear on these Chinese maps for a certain period of time and then disappear all of a sudden? And what is the possible background of what we see on these maps and what looks like a kind of strange mix of, again, what seems kind of to be ethnographic knowledge mixed with some older accounts and ideas about where people live on this planet. So it has not only been an inspiration for you, it has also been an inspiration for me. And I'm very thankful for that. I hope that I maybe, in the next year, at some point, I have time to sit down and write a couple of pages on that. And, I'm still looking forward to feedback, whatever it is, but it's something that is again on my mind, and that is, I partly owe you for that, because you made me talk about these things, and I now feel like I should write something on that.
Actually, for the first time, maybe I really got emotional during a recording, because I feel really thrilled, really happy to hear that maybe our discussions also led to a new project, or maybe led to new questions, which is more important in terms of the progression of the science, whatever that is. But we are looking forward to hear more about your research projects, and maybe if time allows us, then we can also discuss them maybe in this podcast. So thank you so much, Dr. Hofmann, for your time and also sharing your insights with us.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So with that comment, we are also closing our episodes. If you liked our episode, please don't forget to check out the previous episodes. And Professor Hofmann and I are saying goodbye to you.
Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you for listening to the HGGS podcast series, Us and Them. In this series, we bring you conversations with experts from a wide range of disciplines, from the social sciences to the humanities, from law to economics. If you enjoyed our podcast, we invite you to explore our previous episodes and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a new episode. Stay tuned for more insightful interviews coming soon.